In this video, you will learn how to primer and paint on a workpiece. Primers are undercoats that bond tightly to raw wood and other finishes. They are used under any kind of pigmented finish, such as paint and lacquer. You can use shellac, oil, lacquer, or water-based primers, depending on the choice of top coat. The tools you will need are a couple of paintbrushes, a plain blade iron, and sandpaper. The materials you will need are primer, paint, a piece of wood, a rag, wipe off any paint with a plain blade iron. Sand the surface with a coarse grit sandpaper, 80 or 100 grit. Make sure you sand along the grain. Wipe off any dust on the workpiece. Stir the primer with a mixing stick until it reaches a uniform consistency. Pour some primer in a container. In a new can of primer, thinner is usually not required, but in a used can, if the primer has thickened, some thinner will need to be added. Work on a waste sheet of wood so that you don't get any paint on the workbench. Dip the paintbrush in the primer and wipe the excess against the side of the container. Apply a layer of primer along the grain, spreading it evenly. The primer helps cover the grains and pores and thereby enables a flat, opaque, and smoother finish. Apply some primer across the grain and finish by applying some along the grain again. Now let it dry for 8 hours. Once the primer has dried, sand it with a fine grit sandpaper. Mix the paint well with a stick. Pour it in a clean container. Apply a layer of paint with a brush on the workpiece. Spread it evenly, alternating between strokes along the grain and then across the grain. Spread the paint, making sure that there is no excess of it on the workpiece. Let it dry for 8 hours. Sand it with a fine grit sandpaper. Scrape off any primer or paint that has spilled over the edges. You can apply masking tape around the workpiece to prevent excess paint from dripping over the edges. You have now learnt how to apply primer and paint on a workpiece.